Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's episode, Serita Cox of iFoster joins to talk about the release of this year's findings from Voices of the Foster Care Community, an annual survey of current and former foster youth, frontline workers, and caregivers about the state of the system. This is the second year of the survey, and it reveals some pretty interesting findings about older youth's attitudes around reunification and adoption, how workers assess the provision of reunification services and the reasons around removing kids into foster care, and much more. So Serita was a good sport, came on, responded, and riffed on the things that jumped out to me, and then kind of tied it up with some observations of her own about this survey. This will be the last Imprint Weekly podcast for May. We're going to go dark for the Memorial Day holiday, so have a wonderful holiday weekend, everybody, next week, and then we'll be back in June. And when we come back in June, we will be part of the newly christened Safe Camp Audio Network from Fostering Media Connections. What is Safe Camp? We propose to be and hope to be the hub for great audio podcasts and projects in the child welfare, youth justice, and sort of tangential issue arenas around that. So you're going to be able to go to safecampaudio.org or check us out on social media, Safe Camp Audio, wherever you find it, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, what have you. And we will be, in this first year, working with sort of an inaugural group of members that are already doing great podcasts. I've specified a few in recent episodes of the Imprint Weekly podcast here, but you'll be able to go to this, our platform, and we will be largely just doing the work of kind of promoting and raising up shows that are just already doing good stuff. Our hope long-term is that we'll be doing more in the podcast space ourselves and partnering with other people on that. So stay tuned. Coming in June, Safe Camp Audio. Our interview with Serita went pretty long, so we'll be a little bit abbreviated here in the headlines to keep the episode under an hour for manageability. But let's do a few headlines here, and I'm going to start with something that we have been covering in New York at the Imprint for quite a while, which is the effort in that state to pass legislation that would essentially require a Miranda-style warning for parents that apprise them of their rights at the point that Child Protective Services was at the door looking to investigate claims of maltreatment. Now, there's legislation to that effect in the hopper in New York for this session, so it's very possible that that legislation could pass. It's failed in the last, I think, at least 2 legislative seasons in New York. What's interesting now is there's another state on the radar with Miranda-style warning legislation in the child welfare arena, and that is Texas. So House Bill 730 in Texas during this legislative session was introduced by Republican James Frank, and it would do exactly as the Miranda rights bill in New York does. It would require that caseworkers or whoever showed up at the door or parents would notify them of their rights at the beginning of an investigation. And I think it's important to just kind of point out that really in both of these cases in New York and Texas, we're not talking about imbuing any necessarily new rights to parents. This is just requiring that parents are advised at the point of contact of the rights they already have to essentially say, no, you cannot come in to my house unless there is a court order or a court has ordered that I allow you in. There's really not much difference as far as my reading of both bills between the version in New York and Texas, except that in Texas, the requirement would only be that the notification is made in orally to the parent at the door. In New York, the bill requires that it's both provided orally by whoever shows up, as well as in writing. So I guess presumably handing somebody something that kind of outlines, what their rights are, which is something that Connecticut down the highway from New York has been doing for some time now. So this bill, introduced by Representative Frank in Texas, passed the House. It has passed the Senate. So the only hurdle left to getting signature on what I guess would be the first statewide family-style Miranda warning in the United States is just the signature of Governor Greg Abbott. So let's say that Governor Abbott signs off on this law and Texas becomes that first state with a family Miranda-style warning required by CPS agents. I wonder, does that provide the political pressure to get New York's bill over the top? And if so, or maybe it takes, another year in New York if it fails this time for, essentially that message of Texas, if Texas is doing this, how have we not gotten there? So let's say Texas happens first, New York eventually, that's the sort of needed piece of political argument to get it passed there. All of a sudden, if those two states have these Miranda style warnings required, all of a sudden you have almost, 20% of the country's under 5 population. I would imagine something similar if you're talking about all youth that live in states with that provision. And if you're a proponent of such legislation or policies in other states, that's kind of a convenient 2 states to go first when you think about it. So you have a state in Texas, very conservative legislature, state-run child welfare system. You have New York, quite the opposite, very liberal legislature, and the counties are very much in charge of executing the day-to-day of child welfare there. But having both of those as examples kind of, I think, makes it easy if you're in California or if you're in Iowa, really good across all time zones to make the case. This is something that has been supported by some of the most conservative legislators and the most liberal legislators in the country. So all conjecture at this point. We'll see if Governor Abbott signs the bill in Texas and where things go with the New York legislation. There was a demonstration in New York City pretty recently. I think it was when you're hearing this, probably about a week and a half ago, to bolster support for the family Miranda rights bill in New York. Another bill that Governor Abbott is likely to sign, which also has been passed by the Texas legislature. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say he definitely will sign, if he hasn't already by the time you hear this, is the one that bans the provision of gender-affirming surgeries and prescription medicine to transgender youth. Which I think when that happens, is pretty symbolic of just how politically charged this particular issue around medical support and gender-affirming care for transgender youth has become just in these last couple of years. Because the last time legislation to do this, to ban this care in Texas came up, it was not successful. And that led to what became, probably the most focused on controversy of all of these transgender youth bills that have, come up and passed, or actions that have been taken around the country, which was that Governor Abbott instructed his child welfare agency to essentially start treating the provision of medical services to transgender youth as child abuse, which meant that doctors and medical providers who facilitated those services for children, or parents who condoned and, supported their kids in getting that type of care, could now be seen as, meriting investigation for child abuse, possibly losing their kids to foster care, so having them removed. This caused all kinds of controversy, lawsuits back and forth. There was a stoppage on investigations and a start. I can't remember offhand all of the twists and turns, but fast forward about a year and a half, and this has become such a pervasive place of legislation and action in these conservative states that Texas now has passed it, and I'm sure it will become law. And as we mentioned on the podcast, I believe it was last week, we went through, and I'll link to this again, a medpage.com kind of rundown mapping all of the activity around gender-affirming care for trans youth around the country. There's about 19 states that have taken some action, including several who have now made it a felony charge to provide these services. My reading of the Texas bill does not suggest that there's a felony attached. There is some power for the Attorney General to pursue charges, but it's pretty vague on what exactly the penalty would be. But this comes, basically after it's criminalizing to some extent, services that, absurdly the system, the governor had instructed the child welfare system to view as abuse before it was illegal. At any rate, we will keep listeners apprised as we hear more details, both about the family of Miranda legislation in Texas and in New York, and what is happening with these gender-affirming care bills and policies around the country during this legislative session. Next up, I wanted to highlight Elaine Povich's reporting for Stateline news website, reporting on the fact that several legislatures this session, I did not know this until I anything about this really until I read her story, are moving on bills that would require clergy to be mandated reporters on information they gained through religious rites. So I think the most famous and kind of visible example of this, and I believe what the legislation is kind of targeting, are for Christians, this would mean things that are said in confession would be subject to mandated reporting by clergy. So there are new bills in Washington State, Hawaii, Delaware, and Vermont that would do this. I believe the one in Vermont is amending. It's not necessarily adding this as a requirement. It's kind of removing an exception that basically prevented clergy from having to report things in confession and during religious rites, as opposed to just things that they heard in general. So 4 states considering it, 6 states, as Povich reports, already require clergy who learn of child abuse or neglect in a private religious rite, such as confession. So 6 states already require that to be reported. And those are New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas, and West Virginia. It's quite a diverse group of states. No real through line that I can see in those 6 states. And I wonder in these 6 states if the law has really compelled anything on this front, right? So clergy as a reporting source for maltreatment is not a large enough, block to even be named in the annual child maltreatment reports that the federal government does. They're just kind of piled in under the biggest, professions or groups of mandated reporters, where you actually see the percentage of reports from them are, teaching professionals, law enforcement, medical workers. Clergy is just kind of piled in with a bunch of other stuff in other. Now, it might be reasonable to hypothesize that if the mandate extending to confession really mattered and actually produced more action from clergy, that you would see a disproportionate or at least outsized amount of reporting by clergy in those 6 states, which again are New Hampshire, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Rhode Island, Texas, and West Virginia. I don't know, and I don't think there is any, public data to source that to, but I think it would be logical to say that, the majority of information conveyed to clergy from people about actually committing, abuse or neglect on their children or other children would come to them during, a religious rite, during confession. And so if those states were compelled, or clergy in those 6 states were compelled by mandated reporting laws to actually talk about that stuff, you would see a lot more coming from those states than other states. Now, this kind of speaks to the sort of inherent trade-off or, moral calculations that go with the whole concept of mandated reporting, because on the one hand, if you're a mandated reporter and you fail to report this, if you're a clergy and you hear something during confession and you fail to report it, you'd be subject to criminal penalties, right? Or some sort of sanction from the state. The consequence for talking about what is heard during confession by the church might be excommunication. You might be the end of your career in the clergy. So I think the only way that it would ever come to light that somebody failed to report what was heard during confession would be, I guess, if that parent, let's say it was a parent who told their priest they were abusing their child. And then later they told authorities, well, I did tell my priest this years ago. I suppose that would be the sort of circumstance in which you'd find out that somebody failed to report. So I guess this is all to say, I wonder in these 6 states if the fact that clergy are mandated reporters even during religious rites has actually yielded any more information coming from them or not. I don't know. All right, last little bit of news for this week before we get to our interview with Serita Cox. And this comes out of Minnesota, where legislators have passed a public safety bill package that includes the elimination of juvenile life without parole sentences. So, as the name would suggest, this is the imposition of a full life sentence for somebody who was under the age of 18, who was tried in adult court for generally a very serious offense. Little bit of backstory on this. Basically, since the mid-2000s, the Supreme Court has taken on and sort of chipped away at, very draconian, very lengthy sentences for youth who are tried in adult court. Started in, I want to say, 2007 with a Roper case where they banned the juvenile death penalty outright. That was followed in short order by the decision in Graham v. Florida, which eliminated the imposition of juvenile life without parole sentences for young people who had committed non-homicides. A few years later, Supreme Court put a limiting factor in on juvenile life without parole sentences for homicides, essentially saying that those could only be applied essentially where the judge had some discretion or a jury had discretion. It couldn't be just by the fact of a state mandated structure where juvenile life without parole was on the table and just became mandatory. But in addition to that Supreme Court, judiciary action, lots of states have essentially just been saying, let's just do away with juvenile life without parole entirely. And Minnesota is now the 28th state where juvenile life without parole has been just outright eliminated and taken off the table entirely. I should say that the legislature has passed that. Governor Tim Walz has already suggested that he will sign off on that. So this law is retroactive in Minnesota, which means there's 40 people that are going to be eligible for their sentences to be reviewed. Those 40 people, of course, were teenagers when they committed a crime. They are all certainly adults now and will have a meaningful chance at some sort of parole or release sometime in their lives as a result of this bill. Now, going forward, of course, juvenile life without parole won't be an option. What will be there instead is that children who are sentenced in adult court in any way are going to be eligible for supervised release after at least 15 years in prison, which doesn't mean that everybody is going to be released in 15 years who are youth when they're convicted in adult court. It means that at the 15-year mark, they'll be eligible to have, some sort of hearing with a parole board or somebody who will be able to judge whether or not they are eligible for release. In the same package of public safety bills, it's worth mentioning that the legislature also eliminated the use of solitary confinement in Minnesota in juvenile facilities for the purpose of punishment. All right, when we come back, my interview with Serita Cox of iFoster.
Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/child-welfare.
All right, we are joined today by Serita Cox of iFoster. We're going to make this a recurring annual appearance for her as iFoster does the yearly Voice of the Community report. It's a mix of surveys and listening sessions. She'll tell you a little bit more about that, with 3 different constituencies in the realm of child welfare: youth and young adults who have experienced foster care, caregivers, the whole bag, foster, adoptive, kinship, small amount of biological families, and a mix of frontline workers, various ones. So I will drop the link into the show notes for the report, which comes out today, the lived experience guide that comes with it that iFoster put together, in addition to the report with recommendations off the findings. So Serita Cox, welcome back to the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you so much, John. I so appreciate being here. And I like that this will be an annual thing.
Oh yeah, we'll just have you come back every, if it drops every year, you just come back. We'll riff on whatever the big things that surfaced. You still got it. You've been on before, but you got to give the folks at least a recommendation in our best of categories. So movie, TV show, musical group, sports team, or book. Give me a favorite or something you want to recommend to the listeners.
I'm going to recommend two.
Okay.
On the movie front, Princess Bride, you can never go wrong with Princess Bride. You got to know it. You got to know it's now part of our lexicon. And then number two, in terms of books, if you have not read David Ambrose's A Place Called Home, it is phenomenal. It's heart-wrenching, but it is his memoir of his time in and out of the foster care system growing up with his siblings. So it is a truly phenomenal book.
All right, so Voice of the Community report. I've read it. I have my sort of things that jumped out to me that I'll run by Serita. She can give me some thoughts, and then I'll give her a chance to say, here's what you missed at the end. But before we get into any of that, why don't you just tell people what this is and how you go about putting it together?
Perfect. So this is the second annual report. The first annual was obviously last year in 2021, and that started kind of by accident. We were not setting out to do a survey of the lived experience of our community, but we kind of tripped over it. It became something that we thought we needed to do. So we actually, with the help of the Hilton Foundation, went out and hired a research team called CareCG. They're a national research firm that does evaluations and deep dive research in child welfare. And we hired them to analyze our first year survey. This year, they actually created the survey. So right from the very scratch, they created the surveys, they analyzed them, they did listening tours. And this year we went even broader. So last year we had about 2,500 respondents from all 50 states but one. This year we ended up with 4,500 respondents across the entire country. And they were broken into three types of surveying. One was a short survey, which took about half an hour. The second was a deep dive survey, which could take people hours and hours to complete. And then finally, there was a series of listening tours. Once the first survey results were pulled together, that first draft of results was shared with youth, both in care and who had exited care, caregivers of all types, and frontline workers of all types to get their reaction and even more data and qualitative data. So it was quite a lengthy period. It took the entire year to get all this information and then months and months of crunching it. It is a huge report. I think we're logging in at 60 some pages. So it is dense.
It's a lot. There's a lot covered across, really spanning everything from how do these different constituencies feel about the efforts to prevent, anybody from experiencing foster care, right? How things go, how the services proceed with reunification and attempts to reunite families, and then also, the myriad services and supports when that doesn't happen, which we will all dive into. I had one kind of dorky process question though for you, because I have read both now. Soon many other people will read version 2. This one looked very different than last year. It asked a lot of different questions, and I guess just from a procedural standpoint, I'm curious, is the idea in your mind that you guys will kind of shift thematically year to year to try to get at a lot of different things? Or do you see the way that this one is as sort of like the baseline?
That's an excellent question. So we're doing a bit of both. We did repeat some of the exact same questions from year one for that exact point of continuing on. But 2, we went broader and deeper because in our first year survey, we weren't sure exactly the scope of what we wanted to cover. We didn't know what our community wanted to tell us about. So we didn't want to set any kind of concept of where they wanted to go. As it turned out, they wanted to talk about everything, as you said, from prevention to entry to time and care to exits, which is huge. So that's what we did this year was we went deeper into every single one of those areas that they wanted to cover. But we're already talking about year 3, that, okay, for year 3, we'll go back and cover some of the same questions so that we can see trends over time. But we will also probably go deep in one specific area. We haven't decided which one that is yet. And we'll probably put it out to the community where they'd like to see us to really dive deep for this next year. But that's kind of our method.
That's a good mix. I think that's probably the right way to go about it. All right, so let's talk about what jumped out here. I got my list ready.
I'm ready. I hope I can answer them.
First one that jumps out to me, for sure. I'm going to group 2 things in as kind of a theme, and then we talk about them in order. But how young people feel about permanency that were surveyed and talked to, and how they felt about leaving foster care without permanency. Some of them. Right. So the first part of that, you've got these findings, correct me if I'm wrong in the description, but you asked young people who answered the survey, how they rated certain things in terms of its importance in their lives, and reunification with their families. 68% of the respondents rated that not important. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being not important at all, 68% were between 8 and 10. And then for adoption, it was even stronger feelings of unimportance, I guess would be the way to describe it. 80%, were in that 8 to 10 range, rating it not important. I think that will be a surprise to some people. And, yourself having experienced the system, have been working with young people in the system and worked with caregivers for a very long time, how did this resonate with you when you saw the final numbers here?
So for a hot minute, it was like, whoa, because child welfare, even if you go to Children's Bureau website, it will say child welfare's goal is reunification, right? So you immediately have this visceral reaction. At least I did when I saw the data. And then I thought about it for another couple minutes and went, you know what? This is not surprising to me, because the young people who answered the survey are between the ages of 16 and early 20s. And so they've been around the block a few times in the child welfare world. So their answers may be different than if you went younger. And really, it's not that they don't want a family. That's not the issue. It's not that they don't want to have a relationship with their family. And in actual fact, there was another stat that said that the majority of youth, even those aging out, had interactions with their family. They were in contact with their family. The issue is that many of them, not all of them, but many of them who had this viewpoint had been through the bounce back cycle through reunification. It had been attempted and it failed. And they had bounced back into the system sometimes multiple times. And the issue at hand was that the family was not stable enough, was not ready for them to come back. Yes, there were some extreme cases where it was just not a good mix and it should never happen. But in the majority of cases, the family hadn't got the stabilization that it needed, which goes back to why they were removed in the first place. It was poverty, it was stressors, it was substance abuse, and those underlying things had not been solved by the time reunification happened. And that's truly the issue. That's the first point. Then the second point is, youth were very much about that exiting foster care to independence shouldn't be looked as something bad. It's actually a good thing. And youth want to be self-sufficient. Even those youth who are reunified or find permanency would like to have the skills to be self-sufficient because they're young adults. And at some point, they are going to be on their own. Whether they go through a family or not, they're going to have to grow up and be adults. So this notion of having self-sufficiency as a concrete pathway that is just as viable as other pathways and is a choice for youth to make is, I think, very, very significant.
So we're going to put a pin in that and come back to it because I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that. Going back to the feelings about reunification in particular, I'm just going to read this section that I think kind of encapsulated to me, what was meant and what was kind of really communicated by those answers. From their perspective, I'm quoting from the report here, which again, go to the show notes, get the link. From their perspective, their family was still unstable and too often suffering from the same issues, namely poverty and stressors that caused their entry in the first place. not enough had been done to stabilize them and prepare the family for their safe and healthy return. Further, youth indicated the services were still needed for them and their family after they returned. Many youth discussed bouncing back into foster care several times, as Serita noted, through their time growing up until they eventually aged out of the system. So like when I read that, the context that put the findings into me was, first, what you said is absolutely an important factor here. These are older youth and people who experience the system at an older age, giving this perspective. For sure, if you figured out a way to kind of isolate a younger set of foster youth and ask them in real time, especially how they felt about reunification, they would almost certainly, my hypothesis would be, you'd get much stronger feelings about that. But then the other part is, you could almost hear from that, description, there was probably a time when they felt like, yeah, you could have done something differently or more to help facilitate what needed to happen to make my family safe. But now here I am at this older age, or remembering a time when I was in foster care at an older age. It's just the reality of my life in this circumstance that, no, I don't want to be reunified. And no, I don't want to go find a new family. And to that point, I actually think it's also, we're in an interesting moment with the adoption part of that, I think, because there's a lot of good discussion going on about how can youth or young people who've experienced the system build different concepts for permanency on the way out that look more like what you just talked about, which is sort of self-sufficiency as a choice, or like, I think of like soul family, which we've had some folks on from Annie Casey to talk about. I think moral adoptions, what they're doing with You Gotta Believe, these are all kind of like youth-led conceptually. I don't want to reunify. I don't want like what you think of as adoption. I want something different that involves people in my life, but also me being independent,
Absolutely. Having a family. So let's first identify family. Youth will have different definitions of family. It doesn't mean a mom and a dad. It can mean anything. For myself, my family was my water polo team. That was my family. And it's not that the concept of family and having supportive adults and connections isn't there. I think it's defining that so narrowly as being reunifying with your family, or whether that's your bio family or your greater kinship family, or getting adopted. And I can completely understand youth, by the time they're starting to age out, they're 16, 17, 18, they've been through the ringer, and they're just like, you know what, I'm going to go out and be self-sufficient. I'll surround myself by my definition of family.
Yeah. And I think that, so two kind of like lines from the study, which I think these are both in the lived experience guide. So this comes from the listening sessions, I think, a lot, but that really stood out. Child welfare doesn't end at exit as a concept. And this self-sufficiency exits are a choice, which doesn't sound as spicy as I think it is, because I think you're feel free to challenge me here. But that seems like conceptually repackaging aging out as not bad. Is Absolutely. That an overstatement or no?
No, it's not an overstatement. There is nothing wrong with aging out. That is a choice. What the responsibility of child welfare is to ensure that when those youth choose to age out, that they have the tools, the skills, the financial backing, everything that they need to be successful. P.S., by the way, youth would say that self-sufficiency needs to also exist if they're being reunified, because if they're going back to their families, 10 to 1, they're actually going to be helping that family financially. And at some point, they're going to leave that family and they have to be self-sufficient. So it is incumbent upon us that while they're in our care, that we actually give them those tools and teach them. I mean, only 23%, and this is Annie Casey's latest, just to give them a prop, their latest report, only 23% of eligible foster youth got ILP services, which absolutely mirrors what youth in our report said. In fact, youth in our report, few of them, they actually did better, but they're not getting those services that are so fundamental that they need, as services, supports, trainings, so that they can be self-sufficient, regardless of whether or not they go via family or they go completely out on their own on day one.
I mean, that's definitely going to ruffle some feathers, I feel like, because I feel like for 20, 30 years now, the discussion has been about these different paths to permanency, and aging out is the failure to achieve permanency. You're and I'm not saying you're sort of the conduit of getting this feedback, but the feedback from this report, including from young people, is like, no, this is another way to permanency that maybe we need to make better, but that it's one that some of them want.
Absolutely. And in the lived experience guide, there's embedded videos with youth literally saying that their choice was, or their friend's choice was, and why.
This week's episode of the Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by the National Foster Parent Association. The National Foster Parent Association is a nonprofit whose mission is to be a national voice for foster, kinship, and adoptive families through networking, education, and advocacy. The National Foster Parent Association offers resources and trainings to parents and professionals. To learn more, visit nfpaonline.org. That's nfpaonline.org. All right, on to the one piece that the most people agreed on across the three kind of constituencies here was this concept of auto-enrollment. So I'll read a kind of a piece from the report, and then Serita can expound upon this. But one way that youth frontline workers and caregivers recommended child welfare systems address tremendous unmet needs of youth during their transition into adulthood is to advocate for their automatic enrollment into programs and services for which they are eligible. This is something I've talked to Serita about many times, and to Sixto Cancel and Think of Us many times, this concept of, and many others actually have come on this podcast, the idea of not having to wait until people opt in for things for them to get them. So this really jumped out from the report to me.
Yeah, and this is services both while they're in care and whether they're like 1, 2, 3 years old, or as they're preparing to exit. And while in care, less than 20% of those surveyed in our report said that child welfare provides the quality services that's needed when needed. And there's two parts to it. One is whether the service is quality or not. But that aside, what overwhelmingly came out was that there is this huge disconnect. Caregivers, youth, children, even frontline workers don't know about what services exist, whether they're eligible or their clients are eligible, and how to apply. So why couldn't this? So that's a big issue. That then also causes downstream issues of caregivers and frontline workers running around trying to get resources, not knowing where it is, and not focusing on their job. Frontline workers are already overworked, and you've got them running around trying to find resources. If you had auto-enrollment into the child welfare services that exist across the spectrums of health, of education, of employment for the older youth, of independent living for the older youth, of all these other services, even, things like after-school activity scholarships, if that was just automatic, I mean, the kid's number, they have an open CPS case, just make it happen. Children and caregivers and frontline workers could then choose to opt out, but you're not having this running around. And then when you get to our older youth, as youth are transitioning from the services available by child welfare to services available by other government departments outside, so SNAP is a great example, as they transition to adult Medicaid, even Chafee ETV or FASA or all these other things. Why not have auto-enrollment there? These young people are known. They have numbers. So they exist in data systems. They're already pre-approved. Why do they have to run around with their award of the court letter when that already exists in a data center somewhere in the cloud? Even FASA already data dips veterans. Medicaid already has auto renewal. So it's not like these concepts don't exist. They just don't exist for our kids.
For this to be actionable, the idea would be to basically build enrollment in such a way where the unique identifying number of a youth in foster care, their case number, I guess, would act as a magnet for things to get connected to them, as hopefully they wouldn't be in long, but the longer they stayed, different things would essentially accrue to them. Do you feel like any system right now has the capability this minute to make that actionable, or do they need new technology? Do they need new ways of doing business? Like how far would we be if like everybody agreed? It does seem like from the survey everybody does agree, but if you got legislators and policymakers to agree, like how hard would it be to actually make that a reality in your mind?
I don't think it would be hard at all. You already have centralized data systems at the county, at the state, at the federal level.
Yeah.
The CMS, CWS, or CWS CMS system, right? So you already have a single repository that has all of the kids' information in it, and it has that unique identifier. That's then you're just bumping it up against another database of various services. ILP services are actually mandated, so we know what they are. It gets a little more complicated in other more optional services that might exist in one county and not another county, but you have the resident database to begin with. So it's pretty easy. And you can look at other systems on how they do it. Medicaid with auto renewal, Veterans Affairs, automatic. You automatically get suggested, here's a GI grant, here's this, here's that, right? FAFSA, even the Department of Ed, data dips other people's databases, the IRS, Social Security. So it can happen. There's other case examples where this does happen. I think that sometimes we are too afraid about sharing the data on our kiddos because of the privacy and security around them, which absolutely has to be in place. But I think that it sometimes throws up barriers to what would make life so much easier for all of us living in and working in this system. So, we have our Te AmeriCorps program, right? So at the end of their service year, they actually earn a scholarship. That scholarship sits in their account for 7 years. They don't actually get the money, but so the government's already figured out how to do this. They basically said, we've awarded you this scholarship, and that scholarship is good for 7 years. In fact, you could even transfer that scholarship to somebody else, like to a sibling if you felt like it, or a child if you felt like it. But it already exists. They've earned it. They've been awarded it, and it just sits there. Now, if they don't take it, they don't take it. But it's there. It's theirs. Can I just give you another example?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
This is because it's really bothering me these days. California is one of the few states that the USDA allows for dual enrollment or single authentication for approval into SNAP, or CalFresh as it's called in California. If you're on Medicaid in the state of California, your Medicaid, when you get approved for Medicaid, you also can get approved for CalFresh, for SNAP. Happens automatically. They're tied to each other. Now, unfortunately, for some reason, our young people who are on Medicaid up till age 26 don't get that automatic trigger. And so you see, instead of 100% being enrolled, 100% are eligible, when they turn 18, we have sub 20% by the time they're exiting care at 21 and 22. Sub 20% are actually enrolled in SNAP, even though you and I know that food insecurity is one of the biggest issues our young people have. Could you imagine overnight we could go from 20% to 100%? Because this already exists, and it's already happening for everybody else who applies for Medicaid as an adult based on income.
That's crazy. It's like, not only in that instance, it's like not only is there not auto enrollment, but they're disadvantaged over people who are. Yeah. Next one I thought was really interesting was the perceptions of the reason for removals. So now we've been talking about older youth in care and their experience. Now we're going back to the origin of cases and reasons for removal by the frontline workers. So two really jumped out. They were both at the top. Let's take poverty first, because the respondents from the frontline workers, 80% said that poverty plays a role, like a prevalent role, in removals into foster care. Now, I think I want to start with, because it may be in the explanatory stuff I haven't seen, but how did you guys approach defining poverty in that question to them? Are they answering like just straight up poverty, or are they saying
They are
all the things like mental health and things that are associated with, like, that was just straight up poverty?
Poverty. Yeah.
Okay.
Poverty.
Yeah.
Number one reason for removal by frontline workers, they say, is poverty.
So for people who are skeptical of the concept that there would be a lot of confusion of poverty with maltreatment, the workers on the front line of the system, 80% in this survey, said poverty, major reason for removal. Now, the other one that really is high up there is juvenile justice involvement. That was, I mean, certainly we know that this is a growing kind of area of like where we need more dialogue and discussion about like the kind of cross involvement of juvenile justice and foster care in particular, but child welfare. But the fact that 66% of frontline workers said that juvenile justice involvement is a prevalent reason for removal really shocked me that it was that high. So how did that hit with you? And what did you hear from young people and frontline workers in your listening sessions about that?
So let's try the juvenile justice first. That really surprised us. We were not expecting it. Probably an area we want to dive deeper next year, because there is this huge intersection that I don't think we always talk about or see, but clearly and when you dive deep into it, it's all about the older youth getting into criminal justice issues and that triggering a child welfare event. So I think we need to do more to understand that. But if it's 66% overall, you can imagine if we just looked at between these ages and these ages, how much it is, it could jump even higher. On the poverty side, I think this is something we've always kind of known and talked about in a circle and never really just put a pin on it. And I think these frontline workers, then backed up by caregivers and youth, finally said, no, this is it. Let's stop playing around. Because what it is poverty is the root cause that then causes stressors in the family. And by the time child welfare gets involved, it's sometimes too toxic to keep them in their home. They needed early intervention around poverty alleviation months and months and months before CPS gets involved. And that's the issue. It's not something that we as a country probably want to hear and really discuss, but that's what happens. And if you ask a young person, they will tell you that my mom and dad or mom or whoever it was, single mom, they were struggling, and they struggled for months with no help. They worked multiple jobs, and I had to, or my older sibling had to take care of me. And something triggered CPS involvement. And by that time, the family was too stressed, too unstable. So they had to be removed. So I would put forth that if we could intervene earlier and provide a better safety net to families, it would be a child welfare prevention vehicle. The only issue is, whose job is that? Child welfare doesn't have the purview of poverty alleviation solutions. Child welfare doesn't oversee HUD housing or SNAP or childcare or anything like that. And all those three that I just mentioned to you are actually in different departments. So who is going to be there to help a family? And I think some of the recommendations were really pretty cool here. Like, why don't we extend caseworkers further into prevention where they can actually help families? It's not CPS showing up to take the kids away. They're there well in advance. And you have peer resource navigators or navigators that can get them the services that they need. there was this idea of foster the family. It shouldn't be about fostering a child. Foster the family. Embrace them. Maybe have kin go in, or foster parents just do respite care. Do some role modeling and coaching of parents, because what the issue is this poverty is causing stress and stress and stress, and then suddenly it explodes. And by that time, it's too late.
Similar note, I like the way that this was displayed. You basically, in a lot of different instances, had, the appropriate constituency, whether it was caregivers or workers or youth, sort of rate services that are out there and supports that are out there kind of within the system as either available and they're good, available and they're not good, and not available and needed. And it kind of occurred to me that, like, the worst one is really available and not good, because that gives the distinct odor of, like, don't worry, we got this thing. And everybody can just go along with that. Like, oh yeah, we have this. The not available and needed is kind of a good indicator of, like, people should look at that and say, like, oh, these are things, maybe we haven't thought of yet.
Or the respondents didn't know that they were available.
Good point. But the two that really jumped out from the workers list, mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment, 50+% of workers rated both of those available and not good. And I just think that really speaks to, like, those are two of the most important interventions that you could, if you just had to make a list of taking what you just kind of riffed on, which is, like, a lot of this could be solved upstream, whether it's from workers in a whole other system or not, But once it comes time to actually be working on reunifying families who have come into a crisis point, I mean, like, any list of 5 from somebody that knew what was up would have mental health and substance abuse treatment on it. And half of the workers are saying, we have it and it stinks. Like, that's really bad.
Yeah. So and we couldn't obviously put all the comments that people had into the report. You can actually read all the comments at the voiceoffostercare.org, our website. We actually have uploaded all the comments. So you can, and it's segmented by respondent type and by state, and even by questions. So you can go in there and see it. And there were several that address this mental health issue. By the way, caregivers and youth felt the same way. There was a lot of people who riffed on, and this is their opinion, not mine, that our kids are on Medicaid. You don't get the best therapists when you're on Medicaid, because psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, they can make a pretty penny in other arenas. And what is left to be covered who work under Medicaid aren't necessarily the best of the best.
For 2 decades, Fostering Families Today magazine has educated families raising and supporting children and youth in foster care. Delivered in print or online 6 times each year, Fostering Families Today gives families the latest tips, strategies, and research on caring for children with traumatic backgrounds. Use promo code PODCAST5 to save $5 on a print or digital subscription today. Just go to fosteringfamilies.today.com/subscribe and enter PODCAST5 to save $5 on your subscription. That's fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe.
Okay, next one on my list is the interesting mismatch in workers' perception and youth perception on having a voice and permanency. And this is counterintuitive, I think, to what people would think. So 28% of workers said youth do help make the decision around what their permanency is going to be. And 45% of workers said they ought to have that voice. So it's basically, if you just describe the workers' perception, the youth are very infrequently getting a chance to kind of lead the discussion or be a big factor. And almost half are saying they really ought to be. When you look at the youth responses, almost 50% said they were a total driver of the decision making or had a lot of influence. And then when you widen out to how many said at least a little bit, that's 75%. It's like, and then to even more confounding, I thought, was you had that finding, but then some of the feedback that you guys put in from kind of comments from the listening sessions all spoke in the other way to me. It was all comments about not having any agency at all. So make sense of all those three things for me. What do you think?
It is the confounding part. So definitely frontline workers felt that youth should have more say and caregivers should have less. We're not even going to touch the caregivers because they feel like
they do not agree. They feel that's well documented.
The youth, there was a disconnect between the written comments and the survey results, because the written comments are very skewed. Although there are some, like, I love my attorney, they listen to me, the judge listened to me. There are some that are very bitter about it. And I think that very bitterness will rise up more than I loved my attorney and judge. So there's some of that.
I definitely think that that's true. Stepping outside of this, I think it's like, I used to work in restaurants back when we were just starting this thing up, and I worked 3 full-time jobs, and if we got a great Yelp review, it would usually be like, great food, loves my waiter, 5 stars.
Yeah.
If we got a 1-star rating, there was a full novel about why they didn't have a good time at the restaurant, So I do think that's just like how it works.
Yeah. And you also remember, there's an age difference. The youth are 16 and older who responded. And they're a lot of them are looking backwards, right? And maybe they're being more reflective as they look backwards that, at the time, maybe I didn't think I had a lot of voice, but I actually did. And the frontline workers are thinking about all children and youth. And so, yes, at some point, below 16, they probably don't have a lot of voice, or it's not articulated the same way. But I think this is yet another one of I think the bigger issue, the meta on this, is who has the decision-making authority. And overall, you see that the judge does. The person who has the least to do with the child, doesn't even know the child from Adam, pretty much, has the most decision authority. And I think the greater question is that right? Should there be more equity across those people who actually spend more time with the younger kids, who are better proxies for what the kid wants, whether it's a CASA or whoever, or the youth themselves once they get to a certain age? And I'm not a social worker, so I couldn't tell you what the right age is, but but I will tell you there's one youth quote in there that said they absolutely wanted to reunify, and their social worker, their caseworker, their attorney they're like, this is not good for you. This is not a healthy environment, and steered them a different way. And they're thankful for it now. So you could also have that I wasn't listened to, but maybe it was for my own good, right? And you only get that upon growing up and reflecting back.
Last one on my list, and you alluded to this earlier, there's a section where you can kind of visibly see how many young people or former foster youth reported getting services that they were eligible for. And it's, spoiler alert, it's a very low percentage, as the Casey report mentioned as well. One that just jumped out to me, I think, before I go into that, I think the other thing that's really kind of painful when you look at that is, of that group who report getting the services, a lot rate them very highly. It's like in the 60-70% for a lot of them, rated good, very good.
It was the highest rating of any services out there. And by youth caregivers or frontline workers, the highest rating were those youth who got ILP services.
Yeah. So so not to talk about this cryptically, we're talking about educational support. We're talking about mental health supports, medical care, things like that. Things they're eligible for as older youth. They're saying they're good. The one that really caught my eye was one of the very lowest percentage utilized was motivational interviewing. And it got the highest rating. So 16% of youth reported having received motivational interviewing. 71% rated it good or very good, which I think was interesting to me, in that motivational interviewing has been cleared by the Family First Prevention Services Clearinghouse. It has the highest rating. I think I am going anecdotally off my read of the Family First plans because I'm a huge geek and I do read them. I'm pretty sure it's either like 1, 2, or 3 in terms of the most listed by states. So it's definitely something that there's now new federal money for. But was that a surprise to you? I mean, I think of it as something that's more of an intervention with adults, but seems to be pretty popular with the youth who actually get it.
Yeah, no, it was a surprise, but one of those like, oh, this is awesome surprises. Because if you flip back to the frontline workers, they would actually say this is something that's really needed and not available. So it's good to see these coming forth in plans because clearly youth are finding value in it. Frontline workers think that there would be value in it if it was more available, and caregivers as well. So I think it's a great. I'm really thrilled to see that. And I hope that leaders look at that and go, oh, well, maybe we should double down on this, especially now that there's more money coming into it.
For sure. All right. So I've exhausted my list. Is there anything you feel like I ignored that you want to raise up here from the findings this year?
Going across the two reports, and it highlights it in this one as well, there's this overwhelming kind of this overarching theme, if you will, that child welfare is not about the well-being of the child. It's not structured that way. It is not child-centric. And people spend a lot of time talking about what it means to be child-centric. I think we've said this a lot. I think other people have said that it's not about the child well-being. Well, what does that mean? How do you make a system child well-being? And it's really about making it person-centric. And I thought that was very insightful. And if you look at other person-centric systems, and healthcare, whether you like it or not, is a person-centric system. It's all about the patient and their needs. And when you think about that, you think about, okay, there's prevention and there's preventative meetings and all those sort of things, tests I can take, health plans, all of that. Then when I actually have a crisis and I go into the hospital, everything's about me and my care. Everybody rotates around me and my care. There is no other decisions going on. That's what it's supposed to be. And then when I exit the hospital and I'm in recovery, it's still about me. And the measures of outcomes, the outcome measures, the goals that healthcare holds itself accountable to is not necessarily exit, but it's about the health of that individual. And so if we think about that and relate it back to child welfare and say, well, it should be about the child well-being. Well, child well-being has very clear key indicators across physical health and safety, mental health and emotional development, education and learning, relationship and social benefits. Maybe those are the outcome measures that should be measured to determine reunification, to determine exits, to determine how children are doing while they're in care, all the way along, even prevention and entry. Maybe those are the metrics that should be the metrics we hold ourselves accountable to, and not a goal of reunification, but a goal of child well-being through their time in the system and beyond. Which at the end of the day, everybody said you can't just have a cliff, whether you're reunified, adopted, some other form of permanency, or you exit to self-sufficiency. There has to be this extended step down to really determine, is self-sufficiency achieved? Is well-being achieved?
Voice of the Community Report. If you're listening to this on the day the podcast comes out, it is out today. So go and download it off our site, off of their site, which is voiceoffostercare.org. Serita Cox of iFoster, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to Serita Cox of iFoster for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, California-based nonprofit that publishes The Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. Like I said at the top of this podcast, we will be taking Memorial Day off, so everybody have an excellent holiday weekend, and we will see you in June when we will be an official part of the Safe Camp Audio Network, brought to you by Fostering Media Connections. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. And I want to also just quickly thank the listener who emailed us over the last month to point out that I've been saying /imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you in June.